Hi all, this is our third video for Unit 8. This is where we're going to get really into some nuts and bolts. You know, I normally show you stuff in Java, and I've had the comment I should really spread it around between all the languages, and this is certainly a good week to do that because this just works a whole lot better in JavaScript than anything else. So this is a whack of JavaScript. It happens to be in Notepad++, which is a very simple editor. You could do this in Notepad if you wanted. You could do it in Word if you were careful to save it as plain text and didn't get it screwed around with Word stuff. But you can use Sublime. You can use pretty much anything to write JavaScript. It's really just kind of text. It's basically a web page that's got some JavaScript put into it. Now, let's start by noticing this URL here, right? It's a comment. This URL goes to an example that Google put together on how to use their Maps API. And this is basically their example. I've made just a few very, very small tweaks to it. So if you will go to this web page and work with it, you will be way ahead of where I was when I started trying to figure this out. Okay. Beyond that, we start with a web page, right? Doc type HTML, that should look familiar to you. HTML tag, head tag, title, that shouldn't be strange. I think you can do without this meta name. This basically projects a logical window onto a page. I think you get away with it. You could look up what viewport does if you wanted. Care said, I believe UTF-8 is pretty much a default. That's basically the new version of ASCII. Can't call it ASCII because A in ASCII is for American and it's international and whatever. Probably do without that, but you can look that up. That's pretty standard these days too. We got a style tab. We've got a little bit of a cascading style sheet to make things look a little better. For the most part, these aren't very important other than you have to make sure that your map tag, and map here isn't like, doesn't know it's a map, it's an identifier, it's a tag, and we'll come across it in a few minutes. It's a div, actually, if you've seen divs. We have to make sure that we allow it a height of 100%, otherwise it'll default to 0 on us. That won't work well. We have to make sure that the body section of our HTML file has a height or it'll default to a 0. If we end up with a height of 0, we can't see our map. Okay, this is something Google points out in their videos that you have to be careful about. They're careful about it. I showed you the example of this. I should probably show it to you again here in a minute. But my input is a little form, and it's set up so that it stays on top of the map, so the map changes behind it and it stays visible, and it's got a little border around it. And this is how the guys at Google did that. This is a little cascading style sheet to be a little bit fancy. You could definitely do this other ways if other ways make more sense to you, or you could say, hey, it's an example that works. I'm not going to worry too much about it. Once again, this is a div. We'll come across it, the floating panel, in a second. And that's the end of my style stuff and my head stuff. And I'm just going to collapse up my head because we're not going to look at it further, and get down to the body. Okay, we got a body tag here, right? You should know about that for HTML. We have a div. If you've worked with HTML, and divs basically just give you a place that you can hang things on. This div has an ID of floating panel. You remember our floating panel was some cascading style sheet. This gives us an ID so that the CSS, the cascading style sheet, can find what it's supposed to style, which is here. Don't even do a full form. Got a little input field, right? This acts as an initial value, so when you bring it up, you haven't typed anything in, you see Sydney. That's Sydney, Australia. I don't know why they picked Sydney. You can change it if you want. It doesn't hurt anything. I got a button. This is the label that goes on the button. You could make that something. Geocode isn't the best name. I would call it street address or something. Not real critical, right? So I've got my little div here. Here I have a div called map that's empty, when you finish looking your map up, you're basically going to assign it as the value to this div. It's going to display it on the screen. This is all HTML so far. So here we get our JavaScript, right? I believe these, I didn't get around to trying it. I think the stuff inside the script area could go into the head, right? Doesn't really matter though, as long as it's inside a script tag. Your browser will say, oh yeah, that's a JavaScript thing. We got a function that initializes our map, all right, because we just got to start with it to some value. And so we get our, this digs through our DOM, our document object model. It looks for an element called map. That's a div, right? It had an ID, and we assign that to a variable. And we always need to, with Google Maps, we always need to give it a zoom level, and 8's about like a region. And we always need to give it a center, and the center has to have a latitude and longitude. And this is just set up so that we have some map to start with. If you want to, you could start it with blank, but they chose to start with a default map, which happens to be centered on Sydney, Australia. So whatever. Next, we create an object. We create an object by doing a new on Google Maps geocoder. That gives us an object that's our doorway into the geocoder API. You'll notice we'll make calls on this geocoder in a number of other places. Okay. Here we're going to look at the submit button. We're going to add a listener to it so that when we click the button, we'll call this function. This is one of these clever JavaScript things. I think it's a little too clever by half myself, but it works. Basically what this does is it creates a function on the fly. So rather than naming a function, like this function up here is called a init map, rather than naming a function, they create an anonymous function that comes into existence long enough to get passed into the listener, and the listener hangs on to a pointer to it, and we never actually give it a name. Okay? So basically when we click on the button, we call this method geocode address. That's a method we'll get to in a minute. And we pass in our API object, and we pass in where we want it to show up on the page, which is the map div. Okay, that's what happens when we click the button. Okay, down here, this is the function that addresses geocoder. Okay, we pass in a geocoder object, and what we're doing here is we're getting the address out. That's the text field, specifically the value of it. So this is the string that the user typed in. It shows up in get element by ID, shows up in the address. When we create that text field, we gave an ID of address. We get the value out of there. That's what the user actually typed. We stick it into a variable. This is basically just a string variable. We take our geocoder object. It knows how to do lookups of all sorts. The lookup we want to do is an address lookup. We give it the street address that the user typed in. We say we're looking for an address, and this is the address. This is the address that we're looking for. It was in the string. And when you find that, call this callback function. This function here. This function here is we're going to pass in a variable for results. We're going to pass in a variable for status. Right. And this is our function that we're going to have geocoder call. When it gets done sorting things out, it'll call this function. Once again, this is an anonymous function. It's a function we didn't give a name to. We're building that function on the fly. It starts at this brace, goes down to its closing brace. You'll notice that's the end of passing it in to the geocode call. It ends with that parenthesis. So if geocoder said everything went okay, then we take our map object that we passed in and we change its set center by doing a set center to the location that geocoder came up with. So geocoder is going to end up with a latitude and longitude, and those are going to be in this big JSON data array results. We only looked for one result, so if we looked for a set of results, we would have gotten more than one. We're going to take the 0th element because we're only expecting one. Under geometry, under location, down in there, there's going to be a latitude and longitude. But the set center knows how to work with location, knows how to pry out the latitude and longitude. Okay? And so it'll recenter the map to wherever your address is. So it starts off in Australia, but then if you type in New York, New York, it will recenter it onto New York. And then this little bit of code here is going to create a marker. Right? This is a variable that holds a marker object. We create that marker object by calling a new method on Google Maps marker. Right? That creates a marker object. And then we're going to pass some parameters in so it creates the marker in a particular way. We want this marker to show up on a particular map. We could have more than one map around. We don't, but we could. And so we're going to tell it to put the marker on the map that we passed in, and we're going to tell it to put it at the position that we got back from geocoder for our street address. This is the same as where we centered the map on, so it's going to drop the marker into the middle of the map. Okay. If the status is not okay, we had some error, we're going to throw up an alert box that it wasn't successful and show a status code. Right. And then the only other thing we have to do is we got to get this kicked up. Web pages, the JavaScript on web page is a little bit tricky because there's a timing thing. Okay, the problem is if you're not careful when you run the web page, it's going to get around to running through all of the JavaScript before it gets around to creating the document's DOM, the document object model. Since our JavaScript is accessing the DOM, that won't work. We have to make sure that the DOM gets established before we start running around on it. And so to make sure that happens, there are a number of ways to do that. One way is to do this async defer stuff. And this basically makes the page load before we start on our JavaScript stuff. Okay. Now we've used Google stuff all through here. Right, this lovely Google API, right, it's doing most of our work for us. And so we need to go out and access all that. We actually pull the JavaScript that Google wrote across the network, and we do that with this source tag here. And this basically gives us a reference into the Java libraries. Specifically, it gives us a reference into this library maps.googleaps apis.com/map/API /JS. They have libraries for other languages as well. This is the JavaScript libraries, you might guess. We're assigning this to this source tag. And then we've got some parameters. This question mark here, this is an HTML thing. This says after this, these are parameters that we're passing into the thing we specified here. And you'll notice the first of those parameters is this key that we were talking about. We were talking about key. That's the key that you have to get from Google. That's not a good key. That's a dummy key. And then when we have the next ampersand, that's the next parameter. The next parameter says as a callback, call init map. So basically it says once you've finished going out and finding this library and pulling it across the network and getting it all nice and loaded, call one of my methods so I know it's okay to get started. This gets back to this whole timing thing, right? Because I can load my code if it's local, like particularly if you're testing it and it's local. But even if it's out on the network, it may very well be that your code is happening before it gets around to fetching this stuff from Java, and then you're going to be trying to call stuff that doesn't exist yet. So this is set up so the first thing that happens is we go out and get this stuff at Google. And everything else is going to wait until we finish getting that stuff. And when we finish getting that stuff, we're going to know that we got that stuff because then we're going to do this callback. And this callback is going to call one of our methods, but it won't happen until all this stuff that we're sucking down from Google gets into place. When it finally does happen, it's going to call the method init map. We looked at that a minute ago. That's right here. So when the Google stuff is all in place, it's going to call init map. Init map is going to start using this Google stuff that we've sucked down, right? Like we discussed a minute ago. And then the init map stuff We'll set up an event listener on the button, which is down here. And so then when they click the button, the stuff here in this function will happen. Okay? There are a lot of timing issues involved here. But that's all the code, and you can see, including the comment I added, it's 73 lines of code. And basically I added a comment, and I put the key value in. When you download this from that web page up here from Google. You can download this sample. You'll download all of this, except it'll have a different dummy value for the key. Okay, so all you really have to do is change the dummy value for a key to a working key, save it as an HTML file, and then when you double click on that HTML file, assuming that you have your computer set up reasonably so that it knows what to do with an HTML file, it'll pop the HTML file up in your browser, and it'll show up with a map centered on Sydney, Australia, and a place to type in an address, and you'll be all ready to go. So if you haven't done it before, it's a little scary, but it's a good time to try it. It's a very nicely worked example. There's lots on it. Also, in general, once you fool with this, you'll see there are a lot of tutorials out there. Google has a lot of good tutorials off of this website, developersgoogle.com maps. A lot of good stuff, a lot of examples, a lot of videos on how to do things. But also on the rest of the internet, you can find a ton of tutorials. So out of this whole course, this is probably the easiest place to use JavaScript. And so it might be a good opportunity to just give it a shot, you know, try something new and different. If you don't want to, that's fine. You're welcome to use another language. You're welcome to use PHP, or you're welcome to use Java, or you're welcome to use C#. But this is, it's going to take you a lot more code than this, because Google has really done a nice job on their libraries in general, but particularly for JavaScript. Okay, so that's what I have to tell you about Unit 8. It took me a lot of time and effort to work this up. I think you'll save a lot of time and effort having listened to these 3 videos. Hope this goes well for you. We'll see you for Unit 9.